Hello guys, welcome back to Not Just Mecha, it's Marco here, and today we talk about cool techniques to add interesting textures to your models. Time to come back to the big guy, Leicester Marshall from Kimera Models, starting the next phase of the painting process, adding details and textures. After the initial value sketch and color blocking, I refined a bit the paint job, and at this stage I'm in the perfect position to start adding visual interest and cool details that will be blended with all the rest in the advanced refining steps. In the mechanical parts of the figure, I plan to create some real textures, playing with the natural thickness of the colors to create the sensation of distressed old paint and heavily chipped paint on top of some heavy, colorful rust. To create these effects, I use chipping fluid, stealing techniques from railroad and tank modeling. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell button and check the links down below in the description. And if you want to support the channel and my work, check my Patreon page and its rewards. Thanks a million guys! So, let's start playing with the chipping fluid. Almost every brand has its own version now, even Vallejo. In this case I'm using a bottle of Hamo Mig, only because it's a big bottle of 35 ml and I'm sure to have enough fluid for the whole job. For this technique you can use also hairspray straight from the spray can, but it's messy and you have to deal with the smell, so in this case it's better to spend some extra money for a specific product. Using the airbrush I spray a generous coat of chipping fluid, covering every part of the mechanical harbor. The idea here is to create the effect of ruined thick paint that starts showing the previous old layers, with random shapes, different tones and subtle changes of colors. I have already a basic modulation of lights and shadows on the various parts, so the next layers will be influenced by this map and they'll play together to create the illusion of different levels. If you are working with a clean airbrush, you can easily put back in its bottle the fluid left in the tank. It's a water-based product, so a quick clean of the airbrush is enough to eliminate every trace of the chipping fluid. I try to prepare some simple turquoise straight from the bottle and I make a mess. Take 2. I have my base tone ready for the airbrush and I cover with it all the armor parts. I try to be precise, but I'm not really worried about overspray. All the colors around are still a sketch, and when I'll reactivate the chipping fluid, all the overspray will be easily erased anyway. When everything is dry to the touch, using distilled water and a soft brush, I simply wet the surface. This moisture will activate the chipping fluid that now is the base of my last layer of paint. I'm basically taking away the foundations of this last layer, like taking off the primer from a model. It's like painting in reverse. I'm taking off paint to create irregular patterns and shapes. It's a very enjoyable process, but requires some practice to be fully controlled. The good thing is that if you are not satisfied with the result, you can easily do the same steps from the beginning and try again. You can use different tools to create scratches and different, more precise shapes. Here I'm using a toothpick to create very small and controlled damages. Just be gentle and careful, because acrylics tend to be very delicate in this stage and it's easy to move or erase big chunks of paint. Now that I'm satisfied with the result and the film of water is completely evaporated, I can apply a second layer of chipping fluid. When everything is dry to the touch, I spray a lighter color on top of everything. This time I leave a thicker coat of paint in the highlights and just a thin transparent layer in the shadow. This will help to blend the effect with the correct values of lights and shadows, leaving the lighter tone in the areas facing my main light source. And I clean again to create another level of ruined paint. I like the effect because it creates in a simple and effective way realistic volumes, and when you watch the model you can really feel the thickness of every layer. At this point I use a violet ink mixed with some greenish blue to enhance the shadows. This paint is transparent and affects all the layers at the same time, creating a proper believable shadow. I have already my highlights from the last step, so to complete the scale of values I need only to add the extreme edge highlights and a ton of other little details, but this is another topic. The basic effect is in place and I have an interesting surface full of visual information, where I can still add a ton of details because all the tones are pretty similar and the texture is still very subtle. Again, this is still an early stage of painting for a display model, so even a texture like this one has to leave space and a good surface to add stuff on top. You don't need to use varnish, because the chipping fluid is now completely gone, and the layers of paint are strong and stable as any standard acrylic layer. Working on the backpack boiler, I have to use a different mindset. Here rust will be the main thing, so first I have to work on that, starting from the deepest layers and going up. I'll work with very thick paints to create the physical volume of rust, so my value sketch will be completely covered. But in these situations, I simply take pictures to keep a reference of what I've already done. This is extremely important when working on separate pieces of a model, to maintain the coherency of lights and shadows with all the rest. I spray everything with a Molotov reddish brown, to create a nice warm base, and that's all I'll do with the airbrush painting rust. I stipple the whole surface with the brown ink to create a first layer of irregular random patterns and shapes. Let's take a moment to thank my best patrons. Recently some crazily good painters joined our little community and I'm really excited to see what we can do together. Thanks a million, guys! Then I reinforce the effect in the shadows using pure burnt umber. The placement is a bit more controlled here and I try to insist more in the shadows. This is a good base to paint an interesting and eye-catching rust effect. Here is my selection of tones for the progressive layers of rust. Remember that old rust tends to be deeper and darker, and new rust grows on top of that with lighter and warmer tones. Its natural behavior and use are a perfect scale of tones for lights and shadows, so we need only to create a good progression and the illusion is done. Here becomes essential to keep an eye on the pictures, to recreate in colors the perfect value scale. I start stippling corn red with a big brush. Notice that I'm not thinning the paint. Dilution is not a fixed rule, but a tool to achieve different effects. Different brushstrokes and paint consistencies have a visual meaning, and if you are able to use them in different ways, your model will be more realistic and more interesting to look at. This is my first light, and it's still a very dark tone, so it will cover a big surface. Same approach using Mephiston red, but in a smaller area, following the map of the value sketch. Here I mix some Kimera orange with the thick Vallejo game color rust effect, to add some body and a bit of Mephiston red to tone it down, because the hue is too light at this point of my progression. I check again the shapes of lights and shadows, and I start stippling this tone in the upper parts of the tank and in all the areas more exposed to light. Every time the movement is lower and more controlled, to cover with more delicate brushstrokes a smaller surface. Same approach with the pure rust effect. This is just a thick saturated orange, so you can use every orange you have on your shelves to do this step. And I start using a small pointy brush to touch the edges and various little details with microscopic dots and lines. I add also some yellow on the palette, cut with a bit of sky blue to make it colder for the last extreme lights. Here I felt the need to reinforce the shadows, coming back with corn red. Now my rust has a nice basic progression of tones and values, and thanks to the thick stippling has a realistic dimensionality and volume. Rust is something that physically grows on top of metal, and I love to see rough paint coming out from a smooth piece of resin when painting these effects. Now I can use again the chipping fluid. Here I want to create the idea of a layer of paint still fighting against the rust growing underneath. I spray the whole boiler with the chipping fluid. I mix a light blue, lighter than the one I used on the legs because the boiler is in an higher part of the figure, and in the time spent preparing the mix, the chipping fluid is already dry. I use only water to mix paint that goes on chipping fluid to avoid unwanted, unpredictable reactions with other thinners and mediums. Also, I keep the mix quite thick to reinforce the idea of an heavy industrial coat of paint. Don't use the hairdryer. You are working with a delicate balance of layers of paints and chipping fluid, everyone with his own physical and chemical behavior. Heat always mess with these features, so better keep it out of the equation. The backpack is a big centerpiece of the figure, so here I invest a bit more time creating lights and shadows for the blue layer of paint. I spray a lighter tone for the first lights. And I create the shadows, adding a deep purple to stay coherent with the general scheme of cold lights and warm shadows I applied on every part of the model. After a few minutes I can start the fun part, removing this layer using again distilled water and a soft brush. Again, this is an important storytelling step that adds visual interest with scratches and interesting shapes, completely changing flat, boring areas. A toothpick can be very useful to define the shape of panels, especially the ones supposed to be opened and moved. That for sure will create scratches and damages on the external paint with very precise shapes. And here is the result. This is obviously only the beginning, and there's still a ton of work of detailing and definition to do with the brush, especially for a display model. But this can be an interesting advanced stage of painting for a gaming model or a piece of terrain. As always, I hope this video inspired you to try new things, different approaches and materials that is difficult to see in miniature painting. Remember that while painting, the end always justifies the means, and the result is the only thing that matters. If you like this video, give it a like and subscribe. Remember that you can always ask me anything down below with a comment, and you can follow my projects during the week using one of my socials. And if you want to support the channel and my work, check the Patreon page and join the community. See you next week, guys.